Okay, so the Fifth Amendment, this is where we start out. We've talked about some of the founders' ideas. Let's focus on what the Constitution now has to say about property. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, we're going to get to the definition. Let's talk about property. What's property? James Madison says this: property in its particular application means that dominion which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in exclusion of every other individual. So property has this implication of private property, in exclusion of every other individual. It's mine. I act on it. It's mine. No one else does because it's private. I'm the owner of it. Okay? In its larger and juster meaning, property embraces everything to which a man may attach a value and have a right, and which leaves to everyone else the like advantage. See, and everyone else has the same like advantage. I'm not the only one who gets to have private property. Everyone can have private property. But in its bigger meaning, property embraces everything to which a man may attach value. So, your religious belief, your opinions, your land, your merchandise, your money, is that property? Those are all property. A lot of times we think of property, and we'll focus a lot in this presentation on land, but land isn't the only form of property. Even your ideas and your thoughts and your beliefs are property, and you have a right in your property, don't you? Okay? Now, speaking of attaching a value to something, as Madison just talked about, as discussed in my economics presentation, people need to know that their property, their discoveries, their ideas, their whatever it may be, will be secure, and that people won't steal that from them, they won't take from them their liberty. And so that's why you have Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 that says the Copyrights and Patents Clause, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. People have a right to their property, not just real property, not just land, but also their, just like Madison talked about, anything they attach value to, which may be inventions or ideas. That's why you have patents and copyrights. That's a proper role of government to protect that property. So let's get back in. That was just kind of a definition about property. Let's get back into the Fifth Amendment. We're going to dissect this a little bit. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, so let's focus on this idea of deprivation of property. And let's use land as an example. Okay, we'll start to focus and say property is land, even though it's not necessarily that narrow, it's more broad. But let's say property is land for right now. So your deed, your ownership of the land, okay, is that the only value that you have in the land? Is it just the ownership? And a lot of times I think, well, as long as I have the land, or the deed, and I own it, well then yeah, I own it, don't I? But there's another part that I think is even more important. The other part is the use of your land. Because you could own your land all you wanted. You could have the title and the deed and all that stuff, and it's set. But if the government says you can't use it for the things you want to use it for, then do you really own it? No. Okay? So you can be deprived of your property while maintaining the deed. Government can take that from you. Okay? And that's a challenge, because it could, some people say, well, what's your problem? You have the deed, don't worry about it, it's yours. Well, it's not really mine because I can't do what I want to with it. The use is the more important of the two elements of ownership. Okay, nowadays, how does the government deprive you of your private property rights? Through zoning laws. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong, I need to take a step back. I understand. If you have land today and you bought a property, etc., you've bought it under the understanding that there are zoning laws that come with it. So if you buy a property and you say, hey, I know what the zoning laws are, but when I buy it, I'm going to go ahead and exercise my right to use it as I want to. That's a violation of principle. You're violating the contract you entered into. The contract came with it, the zoning laws. Okay? And so I'm not saying that all zoning laws are bad and you have to negate them, you have to fight them. I'm saying zoning laws in principle are wrong in the first place, because zoning laws restrict the use of your property. And it's your property. You should be able to do what you want to with it. Now, in the world we live in, most land comes as zoning. I understand that. I'm simply just saying on principle where the challenge lies. Okay? And it violates natural law. Now, according to the Fifth Amendment, it says deprived of property without due process of law. Okay? So, in the Fifth Amendment, the only time government should deprive anyone of their right to property is if they've been afforded the due process of law, which finds them guilty of infringing on someone else's rights. That's what law is about in the first place, isn't it? To protect people's life, liberty, and property. So if, because of due process of law, you're found guilty, then yes, they can act on you in the protection of other people's rights. But they can't act on you if you haven't infringed on someone else's rights. That's what the Fifth Amendment says. Deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay? Now, is a private property owner who uses his property as he pleases infringing on his neighbor's God-given rights to the ownership and use of his neighbor's property? No, The neighbor still owns and uses the property as they want to, their own property as they want to, correct? So not infringing. So according to our definition we just talked about, government can't act on the individual. Okay? And just because your neighbor has a house color that you don't like, or keeps his lawn in a way that's buggy to you and it's offensive to you or whatever, you can't use the force of law to infringe on what they can do with their own property. If there's no violation and infringement of someone's rights, government can't act. There's no need for them to act. Okay? Now, here's the big question. What if someone is using their property in such a way that it affects the value of my property? Your next door neighbor just has a horribly horrendous, ugly color, doesn't ever keep his grass watered, it's brown, it's all kinds of trash all over the place. And does that affect the value of your property? You bet it affects the value of your property. Okay? So what happens is we have to ask ourselves the question, what options do I have as an individual? I have a couple options. My first option is to go and knock on his door and explain the situation and ask for his help and say, hey, look, the way you're keeping your house, you can do what you want to do, but it would really help me and the property value of all the other people around you if you were to keep it up more. Is there anything I can do to help you? And if they say, bug off, I'll do whatever I want to do. What's another option you have? Say, hey, sir, I thought about this. I'd be willing to put $300 or $400 into fixing your sprinkler system or repainting your house or whatever it is that bugs you. You can offer your time and your money to fix it. Okay, so you have those two options, don't you? But is one of your options to say, this guy's not listening. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to start throwing away all his stuff. I'm going to paint his house whatever color I want it to be painted. And I will do that because I want to have a neighbor who keeps his house how I want. Can I do that? Is that an option? That's not an option. Why? Because it's his private property. He has the right to use his property as he wants to. If I had the God-given right to do that, then I could compel his behavior. But do I have a God-given right to have a neighbor who keeps his house and paints his house and keeps his lawn how I want him to? Is that a God-given right? No. I would like it to be, and I have some really strong preferences. So do most average common sense thinking people. But I don't have a God-given right. Therefore, I can't use force upon him to start saying, that's trash, I'll throw it away. That's a bad color, I'm going to repaint it. I can't do that. Is that inconvenient? Yeah. It is inconvenient. It kind of bugs. And does it lower the property value of my property? Yeah, it does. But if I, at an individual level, can't do something, then what? Then I can't delegate to government to do that for me. If I can't use force, right? It would be a violation of me to go on his property and take his property or fix his property for him. If I can't use force and I'm not willing to use my money and my time to fix it, why would I think that I can have government use force and their time and their money to fix it? It's a violation of principle. Why? Because the Declaration of Independence, remember, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Government only has the power that I as an individual have. Now, some may argue in that Declaration of Independence, the consent of the governed, that's embodied in the majority of the people. If the people in that community, the majority, feel a certain way about certain colors on houses, well, then that's where the consent of the governed is embodied. And that would be true if we were a democracy. But we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And a republic means rule of law. And our law is based on individualism, not on collectivism. Collectivist states, communities, counties, they don't have rights. Only individuals have rights. If government force is going to be employed, remember, it's because someone's rights have been violated. Does an ugly fluorescent pink house of my neighbor violate my rights? No. It definitely violates my preferences, and I can't stand it, but it doesn't violate my rights. so government can't be used. Okay? Let's take the example a little bit one step further, okay? Because this is where we really start to get into this. What if your next door neighbor wants to run a pig farm? Now, that's not only going to affect my property value, that's going to affect my lifestyle, isn't it? Okay? Now, first of all, if the pig farm infringes on my health, do I have a legitimate claim on government to use force to stop that from happening? Sure. Yeah. And you can seek redress in a court of law. But the court of law should think through this and understand, if I came into this situation after knowing the pig farm was there and I moved in and said, hey, this is hurting my health, that's my problem. I made the choice to get in there. And so I'm the one who needs to leave. It's not the pig farm's problem. Okay, so let's go back though. If they say, we're just neighbors, and next thing you know, they want to be a pig farmer. I'm like, I don't want that. It doesn't affect my health, but geesh, no one wants that for a next door neighbor, right? How do we resolve this? Well, the issue comes down to, do they have the right to do that? If there aren't any codes or regulation or zoning on that, if it's within the zoning in the property, then you do have to kind of just buck up and deal with it, because it's part of what that land came with, was the ability to use it for a pig farm. You may not like that. You may say, that's not right. I want to get a petition. I want everyone in our neighborhood to say they can't do that. But guess what? They can do that. You can't write a rule after the fact. Okay? What should have happened? If you wanted to make sure you don't have a pig farm next to you, then what you should have done is you should have made sure before you bought land and built a house or bought a house in that area that there were restrictions on that pig farm. Those are called CC&Rs. Those are codes, covenants, and regulations. And people get together and make those decisions together. Okay? And it's negotiated at the private level. Are CC&Rs fine? Yeah, they're totally fine, because private individuals make those choices. If I want to go into a subdivision and make sure something doesn't happen, if I don't want any animals fenced in, I don't want any animals in this community, I can't just go in there and buy the land and then demand it, because it's my preference. I have to know beforehand, and when I negotiate there, that's fine. But if you're in there and you're already living there, and someone puts up a fence and puts a horse in the yard, and that's already permitted with the rules on the land, then you missed your chance. You should have thought about it beforehand. You can't wait till, this is inconvenient for me, now I want to change it. Does that make sense? So to me, there's a big difference between private individuals negotiating a contract. They can do that all day long, and that'll affect the price and value of the land, won't it? But there's a huge difference between the government imposing and using force and saying, you will do this to your property, especially when it's after the fact. That's the problem. Okay? That's a violation of principle. I think something that kind of sums this whole thing, because some of this is tough medicine. It's hard to swallow. I don't want to think that, man, my next door neighbor could run a pig farm and I just have to, swallow it. Oh, geez. Well, that doesn't seem right. Well, yeah, it's because he hadn't thought about the property rights in the first place when he walked into it. Thomas Jefferson said this, and I think this wraps it up. I'd rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending too much liberty than to those attending too small a degree of it. Are there inconveniences when it comes to private property rights when someone doesn't have the same preference as you? Yes. Is it more than just an inconvenience? Can it actually hurt you financially? Yes. But guess what? I'll take that, because freedom is what I want. I want freedom. And there may be some inconveniences with too much freedom, but I'd way rather have that than the abuses and the tyranny that comes with too little freedom. Right? That's what Jefferson's saying. I think that's a great idea. Okay, I know this is controversial. I know people say, well, that's not right. And I have rights. I have value in my property. You do. And you need to think through that before you choose to enter into these different contracts and negotiations. Okay? Now, the rest of Article 5, the Amendment 5, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now, most people read the end of the Fifth Amendment here, and they say, as long as private property can be taken, as long as it's justly compensated. But there's a little more to it, okay? We're going to look into, there's a little bit more than just, as long as we justly compensate, government can take the land from them, eminent domain, okay? Let's look at it. What it says here is public use. The property can be taken for public use. Now, does that say public good or public use? And there's a huge difference. Public good is not public use. If public good, we agree as a community, more than 51% of us agree that downtown is blighted and this ugly apartment building needs to be taken out, so that we're going to change codes and make it so they either fix it or we demolish it and let someone else go in there who's going to take care of that property. And that's for the public good. But the qualification, the condition in the Fifth Amendment is not public good, it's public use. There's a huge difference, okay? Now let's look at that apartment building for a second. Would the free market solve that problem? Are there some places in downtown that are blighted and ugly? Yeah, and they're just run down, like, man, I wish we could make it nice. It'd sure be nice to have a community we're proud of. Would the natural market fix it? Yes, because in a rundown apartment, what type of people live in there? The people that have a hard time making payments, that may not make payments. And the owner of the apartment will say, gosh, I can't do this anymore. Financially, it's not working out for me. There is no way to make this work out. And so the apartment will implode on itself, right? It won't work. It won't stand. And an owner would have every incentive in the free market to say, I'm going to wipe that out. And I'm going to build an apartment where I can actually make money and not just keep losing it. Okay? Why do these apartments a lot of times continue to stand? So why doesn't the free market solve that issue? Because of government subsidies. What does it do? What does the government do? They pay the apartment owner and make up for the losses they would have had the free market been active and been free to act how it would, where they couldn't make a profit. They couldn't turn a profit on the apartment, but the government says, oh, now you can. We're going to pay you to do this. So what happens if people are looking for apartments who happen to make a pretty decent salary? Hey, I need an apartment. They go to the apartment owner and they say, you can't come here. You make too much. I'm dependent upon the government for my subsidies, not upon the free market where I have freedom and I risk and reward, and I might, Not in this apartment complex. We're tied to the government. They're in charge of this. Okay, that's an economic discussion, but it's interesting. Okay. Now, what about street front property owners who are forced to give up access to their street front property for a bike path or for a new beautification project of the city? Wait a second, is that public use? A lot of people say, well, it's for the benefit of all, so it's public good. It's public use. I say, no, it's not public use. That's public good. A use is something you need. You need to have. Sometimes they need to put in streets or need to put in a bridge. Okay, that makes sense. But just public good, just a bike path or a beautification project, and you're going to take my private property for that? Not if it's not for public use. Okay. Next part of the Fifth Amendment talks about just compensation. Most people, that's what they leap immediately to this just compensation idea. And just compensation is good. It's a true principle. If we're taking from someone, the community is taking from someone private property, then they need to reimburse them with private property in the form of money to make them whole again. Okay? But it's not just free reign. We'll take whatever we want to and we'll just pay for it. No, there's a public use issue, first of all. Okay, so in review, real quick. Fifth Amendment's pretty robust, in my opinion, talking about property. There's three things. The first thing is due process. Due process of law, okay? No one shall be punished by government unless they have infringed on someone else's rights. And that has been proven in a court of law, and then government can act on them. Due process of law is the first reason that any property should be taken from someone, okay? To take from someone their life, liberty, or property, their restriction, you throw them in jail, or a fine, or whatever that be, that's legitimate if the due process of law. Secondly, we just talked about it, public use, okay? There's two reasons which the government can take property, public use, and the second one is just compensation, okay? So in short, the Fifth Amendment clearly states that private property use and ownership can be taken from an individual by government if such property confiscation is the lawful punishment for that person infringing on someone else's rights, and if such property confiscation is necessary for public use and the confiscated property is paid for by the public who use it. Okay? So I know I just reviewed there, but I think it's important to understand those principles. Three principles in the Fifth Amendment that talk about private property. Okay. Now let's go on to contracts, okay? Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says, no state shall pass any ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts. When it comes to contracts, it's not the government's role to set the terms of the contract, right? Just like we talked about before. It's the government's role to enforce the terms of the contract. Now, they are not to step in. The wording here says they are not to make any laws that impair the obligation of contracts. Why would it be that it isn't government's role to make the terms of the contract? Because the only legitimate powers government has are the powers that we have and give to them. Can I force someone to enter into a contract unwillingly against their will? No. So why would government be able to force them into the contract? They can't. That violates principle. Okay? Now, on the other hand, can I force someone to abide by the terms of the contract we've already entered into? Yes. So therefore, I can delegate to government to enforce the terms of the contract. They're not supposed to impair the contract. They're supposed to enforce the terms of the contract that I, as a private individual, entered into with somebody else. That's completely legitimate. That's the scope, though, of where they enter into contracts. If you and I are happy with a contract we made, government can't come in and say you can't do that. You're a third party. You have nothing to do with it. We're both happy with the terms. We don't care if you approve or don't approve. Okay? They can't impair the obligation of contracts. Now, to me, zoning laws, going back to this a little bit, are quite simply laws that impair the obligation of contracts among individuals who own, buy, and sell land. Now, whether intentionally or not, what do zoning laws do? They affect the value of property. And the government ends up choosing winners and losers. They end up evaluating different pieces of land by the rules they make and impose upon those pieces of land. Okay? Now, can you do without zoning laws? Ask Houston, Texas. The whole entire city doesn't have zoning laws. I think they're surviving pretty well. They're doing all right. They're free, right? And if something goes wrong, they have themselves to blame, and they get to make adjustments to it and make those changes because they're free people. And they're not dominated by government's opinion. They're dominated by their own opinion. They get to do what they want to do. Okay? So government-mandated zoning laws create and destroy property value and pick winners and losers in the market. Okay? Rather than relying on a free market, privately owned system that operates based on supply and demand and risk and reward. We turn all that freedom over and say, oh, we don't want supply and demand, risk and reward. We just want the government to tell us what to do. Don't do that. That's not the way to live free and have private property. Okay? hitting the first part of this Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, no state shall pass any ex post facto law. Now, it is true, when you buy land these days, you buy the zoning that comes with it. But some people would even advocate one step further and say, you not only buy the land and the zoning that comes with it, but you also buy the understanding that that zoning could change at any point in time. I reject that. That is not something I agree with, because that's an ex post facto law. You buy it knowing you can put a horse on it, you go in there to put it on, and next thing you know, the neighbors have got together and said, no, we can't put horses anymore. We restricted that now. Whoa, hold on. That is a violation. That's an ex post facto law. It's an after the fact law. Okay?